She sat quietly in seat 8F, a small woman in her 70s with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a simple cardigan and clutching a worn leather purse. To every passenger and crew member aboard United Flight 447 that Tuesday morning, Margaret Maggie Sullivan appeared to be just another elderly traveler, perhaps visiting grandchildren or returning from a quiet vacation. Her voice was soft when she asked for tea instead of coffee, and she politely declined the flight attendant's offer of a blanket. Nothing about her suggested that beneath that unassuming exterior lay decades of experience with some of the most powerful and dangerous aircraft ever built, or that her knowledge would soon become the difference between life and death for everyone aboard that Boeing 737. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Flight 447 had departed Denver International Airport at 8:15 a.m., bound for Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. It was supposed to be a routine 2.5-hour flight over the Rocky Mountains, the kind of journey that happens hundreds of times every day across America's busy airways. The weather was clear, the aircraft was in excellent condition, and Captain Robert Hayes had over 20,000 flight hours under his belt. His co-pilot, First Officer Jennifer Martinez, was equally experienced with more than 8,000 hours of commercial flying time. Everything seemed perfectly normal as the 737 climbed to its cruising altitude of 37,000 feet. But Maggie Sullivan knew something was wrong before anyone else did. It started as a subtle vibration in the aircraft's structure, something so slight that most passengers wouldn't even notice it. But Maggie's trained ear caught the change in the engine's harmonics immediately. She had spent 34 years working with aircraft engines, first as a civilian contractor and later as a senior technical advisor for the United States Air Force Thunderbirds demonstration squadron. She had listened to jet engines in every conceivable condition, healthy ones, struggling ones, and failing ones. The sound coming from the port engine wasn't right. She pressed her face closer to the small oval window, trying to get a better view of the left wing and engine nacelle. What she saw made her blood run cold. There was a barely visible wisp of vapor trailing from the engine housing, and the cowling appeared to be vibrating slightly more than it should. To an untrained eye, it would look like normal engine operation, but Maggie recognized the early warning signs of what could become a catastrophic failure. Her mind immediately went back to that terrible day in 1987 when she had been working at Nellis Air Force Base. She was part of the ground crew supporting the Thunderbirds F-16 Fighting Falcons, and she had heard that exact same harmonic distortion from an engine during a pre-flight check. Despite her concerns, the pilot had been cleared for takeoff. 18 minutes later, that F-16 had experienced complete engine failure at 15,000 feet. The pilot had managed to eject safely, but the aircraft was destroyed, and the investigation later revealed that the engine had been showing subtle signs of impending failure, signs that Maggie had tried to flag. Now, 36 years later and 7 miles above the Colorado Rockies, she was hearing those same warning signs again. The question was, what should she do? Would anyone believe a 73-year-old retired grandmother who claimed to know something was wrong with their commercial airliner? Would the flight crew take her seriously, or would they assume she was just another nervous passenger letting her imagination run wild? Maggie had dealt with skepticism her entire career. In the male-dominated world of military aviation, she had often been the only woman in the hangar, the only woman in technical briefings, the only woman whose voice carried the weight of decades of experience with high-performance aircraft engines. She thought about her late husband, Colonel James Sullivan, who had always encouraged her to trust her instincts and speak up when she knew something was wrong. Maggie, he used to say, your ears are worth more than all the diagnostic equipment we've got. When you hear something that doesn't sound right, you're usually the first one to catch it. James had been gone for 5 years now, but his words still echoed in her mind. Looking around the cabin, Maggie saw the faces of her fellow passengers, business travelers typing on laptops, families with young children, elderly couples like herself. None of them knew that they might be in danger, and none of them would understand the technical details of what she was hearing, but they all deserved to reach their destination safely. The vibration was getting worse, almost imperceptibly, but definitely worse. Maggie had learned to read the subtle language of aircraft engines the way a musician reads sheet music. Every fluctuation in pitch, every change in rhythm, every variation and harmonic resonance told a story, and the story this engine was telling was not a good one. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up carefully, her arthritic knees protesting slightly after sitting for nearly an hour. The flight attendant, a young woman named Sarah, noticed her movement and approached with a professional smile. "Is there anything I can help you with, ma'am?" Sarah asked politely. She took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to say would either save lives or make her look like a foolish old woman. But she had learned long ago that when safety was at stake, embarrassment was a luxury she couldn't afford. "I need to speak with the captain," she said quietly but firmly. "There's something wrong with the left engine."
Sarah's smile faltered slightly as she processed Maggie's words. It wasn't unusual for nervous passengers to express concerns about engine noise or aircraft sounds, especially during turbulence. Flight attendants were trained to handle these situations with patience and reassurance. But something about the older woman's calm, matter-of-fact tone gave Sarah pause. "Ma'am, I understand you might be concerned about some sounds you're hearing, but I can assure you that everything is perfectly normal," Sarah replied in her practiced, soothing voice. "Commercial aircraft make all sorts of sounds during flight, and Captain Hayes is an extremely experienced pilot. If there were any problems, I've been listening to jet engines for 34 years, Maggie interrupted gently but firmly. "I was a senior technical advisor for the Air Force Thunderbirds. The port engine is showing early signs of bearing failure, and if my assessment is correct, you have maybe 20 to 30 minutes before it becomes critical." The confidence in Maggie's voice and the specificity of her technical language stopped Sarah in her tracks. This wasn't the vague anxiety of a nervous flyer. This was someone speaking with professional authority. Sarah glanced around the cabin, noting that other passengers hadn't seemed to notice their conversation, then looked back at the elderly woman who was now reaching into her worn leather purse. Maggie pulled out a small, carefully preserved item and held it up for Sarah to see. It was a Thunderbirds squadron patch, the iconic design featuring the red, white, and blue Delta formation against a stylized wing background. But more importantly, it was a special commemorative patch that was only given to long-service technical personnel who had achieved the highest levels of clearance and responsibility within the demonstration squadron. "This isn't something you can buy in a gift shop," Maggie said quietly, holding the patch so Sarah could examine it closely. "I earned this after 15 years of service with the Thunderbirds program. I've been inside the engine bays of F-16s, F-4 Phantoms, and every other aircraft the squadron has flown. I know what healthy engines sound like, and I know what failing engines sound like. Right now, your port engine is telling me it's in trouble." Sarah found herself facing a dilemma that wasn't covered in any training manual. Commercial aviation protocols were clear about passenger concerns. They were to be taken seriously, but filtered through appropriate channels. However, they didn't specifically address situations where a passenger claimed professional expertise in aircraft maintenance. The patch in Maggie's hand certainly looked authentic, and her demeanor was completely different from the typical anxious passenger. I need to consult with the captain," she finally said. "Would you mind if I asked you to return to your seat while I discuss this with the flight crew?" Maggie nodded and settled back into seat 8F, but she kept her window shade open and continued monitoring the engine. The vibration was definitely becoming more pronounced now, and she was starting to see occasional puffs of vapor that suggested oil was beginning to leak from the engine housing. In her experience, once oil started leaking from a jet engine at altitude, the progression to complete failure could be rapid and catastrophic. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Hayes was reviewing their flight plan when Sarah's voice came over the intercom requesting permission to enter.
This was unusual. Flight attendants typically only interrupted the cockpit crew for serious matters or passenger emergencies. "Captain, I have a passenger in 8F who is claiming there's a problem with the left engine. She says she's a former Air Force technical advisor with experience working on jet engines, and she's very insistent that we need to take her concerns seriously." Captain Hayes and First Officer Martinez exchanged glances. They had both encountered passengers who claimed various forms of expertise over the years, and while they always took safety concerns seriously, most passenger observations turned out to be routine aircraft sounds that were perfectly normal to untrained ears. "What exactly is she claiming to hear?" Martinez asked. "She mentioned bearing failure and said we might have 20 to 30 minutes before it becomes critical." Sarah replied. "She showed me some kind of military patch, and she said she worked with the Thunderbirds for 15 years. The mention of bearing failure and the specific timeline caught both pilots' attention. Those weren't terms that typical passengers would use, and the Thunderbirds reference added a level of credibility that couldn't be easily dismissed. Captain Hayes made a quick decision. Bring her forward. If she has legitimate technical experience, I want to hear what she has to say. And Sarah, do this discreetly. We don't want to alarm the other passengers unnecessarily." A few minutes later, Maggie found herself standing in the narrow galley area just behind the cockpit, speaking quietly with Captain Hayes while First Officer Martinez continued monitoring their flight path. Sarah was standing nearby, still somewhat bewildered by the unusual situation unfolding around them. "Ma'am, I understand you might be concerned about some sounds you're hearing, but I want you to know that we take all safety concerns seriously, but I need to understand exactly what you're observing and why you believe it indicates a problem." Maggie looked directly into the captain's eyes and spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades making life-or-death decisions based on technical assessments. "Captain, I've been listening to that engine for the past hour, and it's exhibiting harmonic distortions consistent with main bearing deterioration. The frequency variations I'm hearing suggest that the bearing races are beginning to separate, which will eventually lead to catastrophic failure. Additionally, I've observed intermittent vapor emissions from the engine nacelle that indicate oil is beginning to leak past failing seals." The technical precision of her language and the confidence with which she delivered her assessment gave Captain Hayes pause. "What's your background, ma'am?" "Margaret Sullivan, retired Air Force civilian contractor. I spent 34 years working on military aircraft, with 15 years assigned to the Thunderbirds demonstration squadron at Nellis Air Force Base. I was responsible for engine diagnostics and maintenance oversight on F-16 Fighting Falcons." She paused and looked directly at him. "Captain, I've been wrong before, and I hope I'm wrong now. But I've also been right enough times to know that when you hear what I'm hearing, you don't ignore it."
Captain Hayes felt the weight of command settle on his shoulders as he processed Maggie's assessment. In 23 years of commercial aviation, he had encountered his share of mechanical issues, passenger concerns, and emergency situations. But he had never faced a scenario quite like this one, a passenger with apparent professional credentials warning of imminent engine failure based on sounds and observations that his own instruments weren't yet detecting. The Boeing 737's engine monitoring systems were sophisticated and designed to alert the crew to problems before they became critical. All of their current readings showed normal operation, oil pressure steady, engine temperature within parameters, vibration levels normal. But Hayes also knew that mechanical failures didn't always announce themselves through electronic systems, especially in their early stages. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said carefully, "our engine monitoring systems are showing normal operation across all parameters. Can you help me understand why you believe there's a problem that our instruments aren't detecting?" Maggie nodded, understanding his skepticism. She had faced this exact situation dozens of times during her military service, sophisticated diagnostic equipment showing normal readings, while her experienced ear detected the subtle precursors to failure. "Captain, modern engine monitoring systems are excellent for detecting problems once they've progressed to a certain point. But bearing deterioration in the early stages produces harmonic distortions that are below the threshold of most vibration sensors. The human ear,
Especially a trained ear can detect frequency variations that instruments might miss for another 10 or 15 minutes. She gestured toward the passenger cabin. If you listen carefully, and I mean really listen, the way you would during a pre-flight engine run-up, you'll notice that the port engine has a very slight roughness in its idle signature. It's not enough to trigger your monitoring systems yet, but it's there. First Officer Martinez, who had been listening to the conversation while maintaining their flight path, spoke up. Mrs. Sullivan, assuming you're correct about bearing failure, what would be your recommended course of action? The question showed that Martinez was taking Maggie's assessment seriously, which she appreciated. Too often in her career, she had encountered pilots who were too proud or too dismissive to consider input from ground personnel, even experienced technicians. Immediate precautionary engine shutdown and diversion to the nearest suitable airport, Maggie replied without hesitation. If the bearing races are separating, continued operation under power will accelerate the failure process. Better to shut down now while you still have control over the timing than to wait for the engine to fail catastrophically. Captain Hayes weighed his options. On one hand, shutting down an engine based on a passenger's assessment, no matter how knowledgeable she appeared to be, was an extraordinary step that would require extensive paperwork, investigation, and justification. It would also mean declaring an emergency, diverting from their planned route, and causing significant delays for over 140 passengers. On the other hand, if Maggie was correct, continuing to operate the engine could result in an uncontained failure that might damage the aircraft's structure, hydraulic systems, or fuel lines. The consequences of an uncontained engine failure at 37,000 feet could be catastrophic. Mrs. Sullivan, I need to ask you directly. Based on your experience, what's your confidence level that this engine is going to fail? Maggie was quiet for a moment, considering the question carefully. In her decades of aircraft maintenance, she had learned that certainty was a luxury that technicians rarely enjoyed. Engines were complex machines with thousands of components, and predicting exactly when and how they might fail was more art than science. Captain, I can't give you a guarantee, but I can tell you that in my experience, when you hear the acoustic signature I'm hearing from that engine, failure occurs within 20 to 40 minutes in about 70% of cases. The question is whether you want to gamble with those odds. As if summoned by their conversation, a subtle change in the aircraft's acoustic environment suddenly became apparent. Even Captain Hayes, as focused as he was on the discussion, could now detect a slight roughness in the engine sound that hadn't been there before. It was still well within normal, operational parameters, but it was there. First Officer Martinez noticed it too. Captain, I'm starting to hear what she's talking about, she said quietly. Captain Hayes made his decision. Sarah, please return to your duties and keep this conversation confidential for now. Mrs. Sullivan, I want you to return to your seat, but I'd like you to continue monitoring the engine and let us know immediately if you observe any changes. As Maggie walked back towards seat 8F, Captain Hayes was already reaching for his radio to contact Denver Center. The conversation he was about to have would be unusual to say the least. Air traffic controllers dealt with mechanical emergencies regularly, but they rarely involved passenger consultants providing technical assessments from the cabin. Denver Center, United 447 requesting immediate clearance to nearest suitable airport for precautionary engine shutdown. Hayes transmitted. United 447? Say again your request, came the somewhat surprised response from the controller. United 447, we have a passenger aboard with extensive aircraft engine maintenance experience who has identified potential bearing failure in our port engine, requesting vectors to nearest suitable airport for precautionary landing. There was a brief pause before the controller responded. United 447, understand you have passenger reporting engine problem. Are you declaring emergency at this time? Hayes looked at his engine instruments one more time. Still normal, still within parameters, still showing no signs of the impending failure that Maggie Sullivan was predicting. But 36 years ago, another pilot had ignored similar warnings from the same woman, and that decision had cost the Air Force an F-16 and nearly cost a pilot his life. Denver Center, United 447 declaring emergency, requesting immediate vectors to Denver International for emergency landing. Back in seat 8F, Maggie felt the aircraft beginning a gradual turn as Captain Hayes changed course back towards Denver. She hoped she was wrong about the engine, hoped that her decades of experience had finally led her astray, hoped that she would spend the rest of the flight feeling foolish about raising a false alarm. But deep in her heart, listening to the increasingly rough idle of the port engine, she knew she wasn't wrong, and she knew they were running out of time.
The next few minutes aboard United Flight 447 were a masterclass in professional aviation crisis management, though most passengers remained completely unaware of the drama unfolding in the cockpit. Captain Hayes and First Officer Martinez worked through their emergency checklists with the practiced efficiency that comes from years of training and experience, while in the passenger cabin, Maggie Sullivan continued her unofficial role as engine monitor, her trained ear tracking every subtle change in the port engine's increasingly unstable operation. Captain Hayes and First Officer Martinez worked through their emergency checklists with the practiced efficiency that comes from years of training and experience, while in the passenger cabin, Maggie Sullivan continued her unofficial role as engine monitor, her trained ear tracking every subtle change in the port engine's increasingly unstable operation. Denver Center, United 447 is 43 miles northeast of Denver International, requesting priority handling for emergency landing runway 34 right, Captain Hayes transmitted, while Martinez configured the aircraft for their unplanned return. United 447 cleared direct Denver International, descend and maintain flight level 240, emergency equipment is being positioned, souls on board and fuel remaining. 147 souls on board, approximately 12,000 pounds fuel remaining, Hayes responded, while simultaneously monitoring their engine parameters and noting that the port engine's vibration readings were now beginning to show slight fluctuations, though still within acceptable limits. In the passenger cabin, flight attendants began the delicate process of preparing for an emergency landing without causing panic among the passengers. Sarah approached Maggie's seat with professional calm, though her eyes betrayed the anxiety she was feeling. "Mrs. Sullivan, Captain Hayes asked me to check with you about the engine condition," she said quietly, leaning down so other passengers couldn't overhear. Maggie had been watching the port engine nacelle through her window, and what she saw was increasingly concerning. The intermittent vapor emissions she had noticed earlier were becoming more frequent, and she could now see a very thin trail of what appeared to be oil misting from the rear of the engine housing. "It's getting worse," she replied, keeping her voice low. "The oil leak is becoming more pronounced, and the harmonic distortions are increasing in frequency. Tell the captain that if I'm right about the bearing failure, he probably has 10 to 15 minutes before the engine starts throwing metal." Sarah nodded and made her way back toward the cockpit, weaving between passengers who were beginning to notice that aircrafts change in heading and altitude. A businessman in the aisle seat looked up from his laptop and asked, "Are we turning around? I thought we were going to Seattle." "Just a minor route adjustment, sir," Sarah replied with practiced composure. "We'll have more information for everyone shortly." But experienced travelers were beginning to sense that something was amiss. The quality of the engine sound had changed enough that even untrained ears were starting to notice, and the aircraft's obvious turn back toward Denver was raising questions among passengers who had been tracking their progress on seatback monitors. In the cockpit, Captain Hayes was making rapid decisions about their approach profile. Landing with a potentially failing engine required careful consideration of weight, speed, and runway selection. The Boeing 737 was still carrying most of its fuel load, making them heavier than ideal for an emergency landing, but attempting to dump fuel with a suspect engine posed its own risks. "Martinez, I want to configure for a high-speed approach. If that engine starts coming apart, I don't want to be slow and low when it happens. We'll use the full length of 34 right and accept the longer landing roll." "Agreed," Martinez replied, already making the necessary calculations. "Emergency equipment is standing by, and they're clearing the airport for our approach." Back in 8F, Maggie was becoming increasingly concerned about what she was hearing. The port engine's acoustic signature was now exhibiting what she recognized as bearing knock,
a subtle but distinct metallic rattling that indicated the bearing races were beginning to separate and allow metal-to-metal contact within the engine core. In her experience with military engines, bearing knock was typically followed by catastrophic failure within minutes, not hours. She stood up again and made her way toward the front of the cabin, ignoring the puzzled looks from other passengers who were wondering why the elderly woman seemed so restless. This time, she didn't wait for permission to approach the cockpit. "Sarah," she called to the flight attendant who was in the gallery area reviewing emergency procedures, "I need to speak with the captain immediately. The engine situation is becoming critical." The urgency in Maggie's voice was unmistakable, and Sarah quickly granted her access to the cockpit area. Captain Hayes looked up as she approached, and he could see the concern written across her face. "Captain, you need to shut down that engine now," Maggie said without preamble. "I'm now hearing bearing knock, which means you have maybe 5 minutes before that engine starts throwing turbine blades. If you're going to shut it down, it needs to happen right now while you still have control over the process." Hayes looked at his instruments one more time. The vibration readings were now showing slight fluctuations, and the engine temperature had creeped up by a few degrees, but everything was still technically within normal operating parameters. But Maggie's calm certainty and technical expertise had proven reliable so far, and he wasn't willing to gamble with the lives of 147 people. "Martinez, shut down engine 1, he ordered. "Shutting down engine 1. Martinez confirmed, going through the engine shutdown checklist with practiced precision. The port engine's power rolled back to idle, then to 0 as the fuel flow was cut off, and the engine began its shutdown sequence. The change in the aircraft's sound and feel was immediate and noticeable throughout the passenger cabin. Conversations stopped as passengers looked around nervously, trying to understand what was happening. The asymmetric thrust from the remaining engine caused the aircraft to yaw slightly before Hayes compensated with rudder input. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Hayes. We've shut down our left engine as a precautionary measure and are returning to Denver International Airport. This is a standard safety procedure, and our aircraft is designed to operate safely on a single engine. We expect to be on the ground in approximately 15 minutes. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." The announcement had the intended effect of informing passengers about the situation without causing panic among the passengers. Maggie returned to her seat, satisfied that the immediate danger had passed, but she continued monitoring the now silent port engine through her window. What happened next would validate every decision Captain Hayes had made based on her recommendations.
3 minutes after the port engine shut down, as United Flight 447 continued its approach to Denver International Airport, Maggie Sullivan witnessed something that would haunt her dreams for years to come. Through the small oval window of seat 8F, she watched as the silent engine nacelle suddenly erupted in a shower of metal fragments and vapor. The bearing failure she had predicted finally occurred, but instead of happening under power with catastrophic results, it happened in a shut-down engine where the failure was contained within the engine housing. Pieces of the destroyed bearing assembly rattled around inside the nacelle, creating a sound like marbles in a steel drum, but the engine cowling held together and prevented debris from damaging other aircraft systems. "Captain!" Maggie called out, her voice cutting through the cabin noise as she stood up and waved toward the front of the aircraft. Sarah, who had been keeping a watchful eye on the woman who had potentially saved their lives, immediately understood and relayed the message to the cockpit. "The engine just failed completely," Maggie reported when Captain Hayes came on the intercom to speak with her. "The bearing assembly has completely disintegrated, just as I predicted. If we had still been running that engine under power when it happened," she didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the cockpit understood the implications. An uncontained engine failure at altitude, with turbine blades and metal fragments potentially piercing the aircraft's fuselage, fuel tanks, or flight control systems, could have been catastrophic. Instead, they were now dealing with a manageable, single-engine approach to a major airport with full emergency support standing by. Captain Hayes felt a wave of relief mixed with professional vindication wash over him. The decision to trust Maggie's assessment and shut down the engine proactively had been the right call, even though it had seemed extreme at the time.
Now, with the failed engines safely shut down and contained, they could focus on executing a textbook single-engine landing. Denver Tower, United 447 reporting complete failure of Engine 1 after precautionary shutdown. Engine failure contained, no other systems affected. Continuing approach runway 34 right. Hayes transmitted. United 447 cleared to land runway 34 right. Emergency vehicles are standing by. Weather is clear, winds calm. In the passenger cabin, the atmosphere had shifted from nervous curiosity to outright concern. The sound of the engine failure had been audible throughout the aircraft, and passengers could see emergency vehicles racing along the airport perimeter through their windows as the aircraft approached Denver International. A middle-aged man in seat 12C stood up and looked around the cabin with obvious anxiety. "What was that noise? Something's wrong with this plane." Before panic could spread, Maggie Sullivan stood up from seat 8F and spoke with the calm authority of someone who had spent decades dealing with aircraft emergencies. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the cabin, "I'm a retired Air Force aircraft maintenance specialist, and I want to assure you that what you heard was an engine failure that occurred after the engine was already safely shut down. Our pilots made exactly the right decision, and we are in no danger. Single-engine landings are routine procedures that commercial pilots train for regularly." Her words had an immediate calming effect on the passengers. Here was someone who clearly knew what she was talking about, someone who wasn't a member of the crew trying to manage their fears, but rather an independent expert who was reassuring them based on professional knowledge. Sarah, the flight attendant, looked at Maggie with newfound respect and gratitude. Crisis management in the passenger cabin was always challenging, but having a credible technical voice helping to maintain calm was invaluable. "Thank you, Mrs. Sullivan," Sarah said quietly, as Maggie settled back into her seat. As Flight 447 descended through 5,000 feet on final approach to Denver International, Captain Hayes and First Officer Martinez worked through their single-engine landing checklist with the precision of a well-rehearsed team. The Boeing 737 handled beautifully on one engine, its design margins providing ample safety reserves for this type of emergency. "Gear down, flaps 30, single-engine approach checklist complete," Martinez announced as they configured the aircraft for landing. "Denver Tower, United 447 is 3 miles final, single-engine approach requesting long landing clearance." United 447 cleared to land runway 34 right, long landing approved, emergency rescue standing by. Through her window, Maggie could see the emergency vehicles positioned along the runway, fire trucks, ambulances, and airport rescue equipment, all standing ready to respond if needed. But she knew they wouldn't be needed. The pilots had executed a flawless emergency response, and the aircraft was performing exactly as it was designed to do so. The landing was smooth and controlled, with Captain Hayes touching down gently on the centerline and using only minimal braking to bring the aircraft to a stop well before the end of the long runway. Emergency personnel immediately surrounded the aircraft, inspecting the failed engine and ensuring that there were no fire hazards or other safety concerns. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Denver International Airport," came Captain Hayes' voice over the intercom. "We've landed safely, and emergency personnel are conducting routine inspections of our aircraft. We'll be deplaning momentarily, and United customer service representatives will be available to assist with rebooking on later flights to Seattle." As passengers began gathering their belongings and preparing to deplane, many of them approached Maggie to thank her for her reassuring words during the crisis, but she deflected their gratitude, knowing that the real heroes were the flight crew who had listened to her concerns and made the difficult decision to trust her assessment. What none of the passengers knew yet was that post-incident investigation would reveal that Maggie's timing had been perfect. Analysis of the failed engine showed that the bearing assembly had been less than 2 minutes away from complete catastrophic failure when Captain Hayes made the decision to shut it down. If they had continued operating the engine under power when it happened, the failure would have occurred with the engine producing maximum thrust, potentially sending turbine blades through the engine casing and into critical aircraft systems. But as Flight 447's passengers filed off the aircraft and into the terminal, all they knew was that they had just experienced one of the most professionally handled aviation emergencies in recent memory, guided by the expertise of a quiet woman in seat 8F, whose knowledge had quite possibly saved all of their lives.
The aftermath of the United Flight 447's emergency landing at Denver International Airport would become a case study in aviation safety, crew resource management, and the importance of listening to experienced voices regardless of where they come from. But in the immediate hours following their safe arrival, Maggie Sullivan found herself thrust into a spotlight she had never sought and wasn't entirely comfortable with. As passengers deplaned, word of her role in identifying the engine problem began to spread. Fellow travelers approached her with gratitude and curiosity, wanting to know more about the woman whose expertise had potentially saved their lives. Airport personnel, airline officials, and eventually media representatives all sought her out for interviews and statements. Mrs. Sullivan, can you walk us through exactly what you heard that made you believe the engine was going to fail? Asked Janet Morrison, a National Transportation Safety Board investigator who had been dispatched to Denver to begin the preliminary investigation into the incident. They were sitting in a quiet corner of the airport's administrative offices, away from the crowds and cameras that had gathered in the main terminal. Maggie appreciated the investigator's professional approach and attention to technical details rather than sensational aspects of the story. I've been analyzing aircraft engine acoustics for over 30 decades, Maggie began, her voice steady and precise. What I initially heard was a harmonic distortion in the engine's idle signature, a subtle roughness that indicated bearing wear beyond normal parameters. As the flight progressed, this evolved into what we call bearing knock, which is the sound of metal-to-metal contact within the bearing races. Morrison took careful notes as Maggie continued her technical explanation. The progression from harmonic distortion to bearing knock typically occurs over a 15 to 30-minute time frame in cases of imminent bearing failure. Based on my experience with similar failures in military aircraft, I estimated we had 20 to 30 minutes before catastrophic failure when I first approached the flight crew. And your assessment proved accurate, Morrison observed. Our preliminary examination of the failed engine shows complete bearing assembly failure occurred approximately 3 minutes after shutdown. If the engine had still been operating under power, the results would have been much different, Maggie finished quietly. Uncontained engine failures have caused hull losses and fatalities in commercial aviation. Captain Hayes and his crew made exactly the right decision in shutting down the engine when they did. Meanwhile, in another part of the airport, Captain Robert Hayes was conducting his own debrief with airline officials and federal investigators. The question everyone wanted answered was how a passenger had detected a problem that the aircraft's sophisticated monitoring systems had missed until the final minutes before failure. Captain, can you walk us through your decision-making process when Mrs. Sullivan first approached you with her concerns? Asked Frank Rodriguez, United Airlines chief pilot for the Denver hub. Hayes leaned back in his chair, still processing the events of the morning. Frank, in 23 years of commercial flying, I've never encountered a situation quite like this one. We had a passenger claiming professional expertise in aircraft engine maintenance, backing up that claim with specific technical language and credentials, and providing a detailed assessment that contradicted our instrument readings. He paused, gathering his thoughts. The deciding factors for me were her technical vocabulary, her specific timeline prediction, and the fact that she wasn't exhibiting any signs of typical passenger anxiety. She was calm, professional, and speaking with the confidence of someone who had dealt with these situations before. Rodriguez nodded. The preliminary engine inspection confirms that her assessment was remarkably accurate. The bearing failure occurred almost exactly within her predicted time frame. What concerns me, Hayes continued, is that our monitoring systems didn't detect the problem until it was almost too late. If Mrs. Sullivan hadn't been on that flight, we might have continued to Seattle and experienced an uncontained engine failure at cruise altitude over the Rocky Mountains. The implications of that scenario were sobering for everyone in the room. Uncontained engine failures had caused some of the most serious accidents in commercial aviation history, and the mountainous terrain between Denver and Seattle would have provided few options for emergency landing sites.
Back in the main terminal, Maggie found herself surrounded by passengers from Flight 447 who wanted to thank her personally. Among them was Maria Santos, a young mother who had been traveling with her 2 children to visit family in Seattle. "Mrs. Sullivan, I just wanted you to know that my children are asking about the nice lady who helped keep everyone safe," Maria said, her voice emotional. "They don't fully understand what happened, but they know you were important." Maggie smiled and knelt down to speak with Maria's 7-year-old daughter, Sophia, who was clutching a small stuffed airplane. "You know, Sophia, airplanes are very safe, and the pilots who fly them are very smart. Sometimes airplanes need a little extra help, just like when you're not feeling well and need to see a doctor. Today, I was able to help the pilots take care of our airplane so everyone could be safe." Sophia nodded solemnly and then asked, "Were you scared?" Maggie considered the question carefully. "A little bit," she admitted. "But I've learned that when you know how to help in a scary situation, the best thing to do is to help, even if you're nervous about it." As the afternoon wore on, news of the incident began spreading beyond the airport. Aviation websites picked up the story, then local news stations, and eventually national media outlets. The narrative of a retired Air Force technician whose expertise saved a commercial flight captured public imagination in a way that routine aviation safety stories rarely did. Dr. James Peterson, an aviation safety researcher at the University of Colorado, was contacted by several news outlets for his perspective on the incident. He explained to a CNN reporter, "What makes this case particularly interesting is that it highlights the value of human expertise in an age of increasingly automated aircraft systems. Mrs. Sullivan's trained ear detected acoustic signatures that sophisticated electronic monitoring systems missed." He continued, "This incident will likely prompt discussions about how airlines can better incorporate external expertise into their safety protocols. While we can't have aircraft maintenance specialists on every flight, there may be ways to create systems that allow qualified individuals to contribute to flight safety when circumstances warrant." The story also caught the attention of the Air Force Thunderbirds organization at Nellis Air Force Base, where Maggie had spent 15 years of her career. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, the current Thunderbirds commander, issued a statement praising Maggie's professionalism and highlighting the lasting value of the technical training provided to Air Force personnel. Mrs. Sullivan's actions aboard United Flight 447 exemplify the highest standards of the United States Air Force and demonstrate the enduring value of the technical expertise our personnel developed during their service. Her ability to recognize and respond to a potentially catastrophic situation reflects the kind of professional excellence we strive to instill in all our team members. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. As Maggie was finally preparing to leave the airport and catch a later flight to Seattle, she was approached by a young woman in a United Airlines uniform. "Mrs. Sullivan, I'm Jennifer Martinez, the first officer from your flight this morning." Maggie looked up in surprise. "Officer Martinez, you and Captain Hayes handled that situation perfectly. I hope I didn't make things more difficult by inserting myself into your procedures." Martinez shook her head emphatically. "Ma'am, you probably saved our lives today. Our post-flight analysis shows that engine would have failed catastrophically if we had continued operating it. I wanted to thank you personally and to tell you that you've reminded me why aviation safety depends on people like you who aren't afraid to speak up when something doesn't seem right." The two women shook hands, representing a moment of connection between different generations and different aspects of aviation. The experienced technician whose career was winding down, and the professional pilot whose career was still ascending, united by their shared commitment to safety and excellence in aviation. As Maggie finally boarded her rescheduled flight to Seattle that evening, she reflected on the day's events. She had never imagined that her retirement travel would include diagnosing engine failures and working with flight crews to prevent potential disasters. But as she settled into her seat and listened to the healthy, steady sound of the aircraft's engines, she felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that her decades of experience had proven valuable one more time when it mattered most.
The story of United Flight 447 and Maggie Sullivan's intervention might have ended there, with a successful emergency landing and grateful passengers continuing their journeys. But the aviation industry's commitment to learning from every incident, especially those involving near-catastrophic failures, meant that the real investigation was just beginning. Over the following weeks, the case would reveal systemic issues that extended far beyond a single failed engine bearing. The National Transportation Safety Board's detailed examination of the failed engine revealed a troubling timeline that validated Maggie's assessment with startling precision. The main bearing assembly had been deteriorating for several weeks before the flight, showing microscopic stress fractures and metal fatigue that should have been detected during routine maintenance inspections. What we found was a classic case of bearing race separation caused by lubrication system degradation, explained Dr. Michael Chen, the NTSB's lead engine specialist on the investigation. The bearing had been operating with insufficient oil flow for an estimated 200 to 300 flight hours, which allowed excessive heat buildup and metal fatigue to develop. The investigation team discovered that the engine's oil system had developed a partial blockage in one of the lubrication lines feeding the main bearing assembly. This blockage was subtle enough to maintain adequate oil pressure readings on the aircraft's monitoring systems, but insufficient to provide proper lubrication under the stress of sustained high-altitude operation. Mrs. Sullivan's assessment that the bearing would fail within 20 to 30 minutes proved remarkably accurate, Dr. Chen continued. Our metallurgical analysis shows that the bearing races had separated to the point where catastrophic failure was imminent. If the engine had remained under power, we estimate failure would have occurred within 15 to 20 minutes of her initial warning. But the investigation also revealed a more troubling aspect of the incident. The engine in question had been flagged by maintenance crews at 3 different airports over the previous month for unusual engine noise during ground operations. Each time, the engine had been inspected, tested, and cleared for service because the acoustic anomalies weren't sufficient to trigger formal maintenance actions under existing protocols. Thomas Harrison, a senior mechanic at United's Denver maintenance facility, was interviewed as part of the investigation. "I remember that engine," he told investigators. "We had reports from ground crews about roughness during engine runs, but all our diagnostic tests came back normal. Oil pressure good, temperature normal, vibration within limits. By the book, there was nothing wrong with it." This revelation highlighted a critical gap in commercial aviation maintenance protocols. Unlike military aircraft maintenance, where experienced technicians like Maggie Sullivan had the authority to ground aircraft based on subjective assessments of engine performance, commercial aviation relied heavily on objective, measurable criteria that could be documented and defended. The Federal Aviation Administration took notice. Within 6 months of the Flight 447 incident, the FAA began developing new guidelines for incorporating subjective maintenance assessments into commercial aircraft inspection protocols. The initiative became known informally as the Sullivan Protocol, though Maggie herself was never comfortable with that designation. "I didn't do anything special," she insisted during a congressional hearing on aviation safety 6 months after the incident. "I just listened to an engine that was telling me it was in trouble. Any experienced technician would have heard the same things I heard." Congressman Robert Martinez, chairman of the House Subcommittee on Aviation Safety, pressed her on this point. "Mrs. Sullivan, according to testimony we've heard, 3 different maintenance crews heard similar anomalies but didn't ground the aircraft. What made your assessment different?" Maggie thought carefully before responding. "Congressman, in military aviation, we operate under different risk tolerances than commercial aviation. When you're responsible for a $30 million fighter aircraft and a pilot's life, you tend to err on the side of caution. Commercial aviation has to balance safety with operational efficiency, which creates different decision-making criteria." She paused, then continued. "But I think what's important to understand is that engines communicate with us constantly. They tell us about their health through sound, vibration, temperature, and a dozen other subtle indicators.
The challenge is teaching people to listen to what the engines are saying. The congressional hearing also featured testimony from Captain Robert Hayes, who had become something of an advocate for incorporating experienced technical voices into commercial aviation safety protocols. What Mrs. Sullivan demonstrated, Hayes told the committee, is that there's value in experiential knowledge that goes beyond what we can measure. The question is how we create systems that can capture and utilize that knowledge while maintaining the objective standards that commercial aviation requires. The hearing room was packed with aviation industry representatives, safety advocates, and media personnel, all interested in understanding how the lessons from Flight 447 could be applied more broadly to commercial aviation safety. Dr. Lisa Rodriguez, representing the Flight Safety Foundation, testified about the broader implications of the incident. What we're seeing with Flight 447 is a perfect example of what researchers call weak signal detection, the ability to identify problems before they become obvious through conventional monitoring methods. Mrs. Sullivan possessed this capability because of her extensive experience with aircraft engines under various operating conditions. The testimony revealed that similar incidents had occurred in other countries where experienced maintenance personnel had detected engine problems that sophisticated monitoring systems had missed. In several cases, these early warnings had prevented accidents, but in others, the warnings had been dismissed because they couldn't be verified through standard diagnostic procedures. International aviation safety organizations began taking notice of the Flight 447 case as well. The International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, initiated a study of maintenance protocols across member nations, looking for ways to incorporate experiential knowledge into formal safety systems without compromising the objective standards that made commercial aviation so remarkably safe. Meanwhile, Maggie Sullivan found herself reluctantly becoming a public figure in aviation safety circles. She received invitations to speak at maintenance conferences, safety symposiums, and industry gatherings around the world. Initially resistant to the attention, she eventually came to see these opportunities as chances to honor the memory of her late husband and the Air Force personnel who had shaped her understanding of aircraft systems. "James always told me that knowledge is only valuable if you share it," she said during a keynote speech at the Aircraft Maintenance Technology Conference in Las Vegas. "I spent 34 years learning to listen to aircraft engines. If sharing that knowledge can help prevent even one accident, then all the attention and travel is worthwhile." Her presentations typically focused on the technical aspects of engine diagnostics, but she always concluded with a broader message about the importance of speaking up when something doesn't seem right, regardless of one's position in an organization's hierarchy. "Safety doesn't have rank," became her signature closing line. Whether you're a ground crew member, a flight attendant, a passenger, or a retired technician sitting in seat 8F, if you see or hear something that suggests a safety concern, you have both the right and the responsibility to voice that concern. 6 months after the Flight 447 incident, Maggie Sullivan received an unexpected phone call that would bring her story full circle. The caller was Colonel Sarah Mitchell, commander of the Air Force Thunderbirds demonstration squadron, extending an invitation that would reconnect Maggie with the organization that had shaped her expertise and career. "Mrs. Sullivan, we would be honored to have you join us at Nellis Air Force Base for our annual alumni gathering and safety conference," Colonel Mitchell said during their conversation. "Your actions on Flight 447 exemplify everything we strive to teach our technical personnel about situational awareness and professional courage." The invitation meant more to Maggie than any of the civilian recognition she had received. The Thunderbirds had been her professional home for 15 years, the place where she had learned to diagnose engine problems by sound, where she had developed the confidence to trust her technical instincts, and where she had met her late husband, James. 2 weeks later, Maggie found herself back at Nellis Air Force Base for the first time in 8 years, walking through hangars that held decades of memories. The F-16 Fighting Falcons of the current Thunderbirds team sat in their familiar formation, their red, white, and blue paint schemes gleaming under the hangar lights.
Technical Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, the current lead engine specialist for the team, gave Maggie a tour of the modern maintenance facilities. "Mrs. Sullivan, I've heard stories about you for years," Gonzalez said as they examined one of the F-16 engines. "Senior Master Sergeant Williams always talks about the technician who could diagnose engine problems just by listening to them run." Maggie smiled at the mention of her former supervisor, now retired but still legendary among Thunderbirds maintenance personnel. "Tommy Williams taught me everything I know about reading engine acoustics. Is he still insisting that engines talk to you if you know how to listen?" "Every day," Gonzalez laughed. "And after what you did on that United flight, we're all paying a lot more attention to what our engines are telling us." The formal ceremony that evening brought together current and former Thunderbirds personnel from 5 decades of the demonstration squadron's history. Maggie was seated at the head table, still somewhat uncomfortable with the attention, but grateful for the opportunity to reconnect with colleagues and friends from her Air Force years. Colonel Mitchell's introduction was both personal and professional. "Tonight, we honor someone who embodies the technical excellence and professional courage that defined the Thunderbirds organization. Margaret Sullivan served with distinction as a civilian technical advisor to our squadron for 15 years, but her service to aviation safety didn't end with her retirement." The colonel recounted the details of Flight 447, emphasizing how Maggie's willingness to speak up and trust her technical expertise had potentially saved 147 lives. What Mrs. Sullivan demonstrated that day was that the knowledge and skills we develop in the Air Force don't just belong to us, they belong to the broader aviation community and to society as a whole. But the evening's most meaningful moment came when Senior Master Sergeant Tommy Williams, now in his 70s but still sharp and energetic, took the stage to present Maggie with a special recognition. "Maggie Sullivan was the best engine diagnostician I ever worked with," Williams said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium. "She could hear things the rest of us missed, and she was never afraid to ground an aircraft when something didn't sound right. But more than that, she taught all of us that listening to engines is an art as much as a science." He held up a specially created plaque that featured the Thunderbirds emblem alongside a reproduction of the maintenance badge Maggie had worn during her years with the squadron. "This is to recognize not just what you did on Flight 447, but for 34 years of keeping Air Force pilots safe and for showing the world what Air Force technical training produces." As Maggie accepted the award, she found herself thinking about all the people who had shaped her career and her understanding of aircraft systems. Her voice was steady but emotional as she spoke to the assembled crowd. "This recognition belongs to everyone who taught me to trust my ears and my instincts. Tommy Williams, Master Sergeant Robinson, Colonel Sullivan, my late husband, and dozens of other people who showed me that taking care of aircraft isn't just a job, it's a sacred responsibility." She looked out at the current Thunderbirds team members, young men and women who reminded her of herself 4 decades ago. What happened on Flight 447 wasn't about me being a hero. It was about applying the knowledge and training that this organization gave me. Every day, Air Force personnel around the world are making similar decisions based on the same training and the same commitment to excellence. The audience erupted in sustained applause. But Maggie wasn't finished. "I want to challenge everyone here, whether you're currently serving or retired, to remember that the skills you learn in the Air Force don't stop being useful when you take off the uniform. Stay engaged, stay alert, and never hesitate to speak up when your experience tells you something isn't right." After the ceremony, Maggie spent hours talking with current and former Air Force personnel, sharing technical knowledge and listening to their stories. A young airman named Staff Sergeant Jennifer Kim approached her with a question that seemed to sum up the evening's significance. "Mrs. Sullivan, how do you know when to trust your instincts over what the instruments are telling you?" Maggie considered the question carefully, remembering asking similar questions herself early in her career. "Sergeant Kim, instruments are tools, and like all tools, they have limitations.
They can tell you what's happening right now, but they can't always predict what's going to happen next. Your ears, your experience, and your intuition can sometimes detect patterns that instruments miss. She paused, then continued, but here's the important part. You never ignore the instruments and you never make decisions based solely on intuition. What you do is integrate all the information available to you, instruments, visual observations, acoustic signatures, experience, and yes, instinct, and then make the best decision you can with the information you have. And if you're wrong, then you learn from it. But in my experience, it's better to be cautious and wrong than to ignore warning signs and be catastrophically right. The conversation continued late into the evening with technical discussions about engine diagnostics, maintenance procedures, and the evolving relationship between human expertise and automated systems in modern aviation. For Maggie, it felt like coming home to a community that understood the complexities and responsibilities of keeping aircraft safe.
The impact of Maggie Sullivan's intervention on Flight 447 extended far beyond the immediate safety outcome, sparking changes in aviation training, maintenance protocols, and safety culture that would influence the industry for years to come. As the story spread through aviation circles worldwide, it became a catalyst for broader discussions about human factors in aircraft safety and the role of experience in an increasingly automated industry. At the Federal Aviation Administration headquarters in Washington, D.C., a working group was formed to study the implications of the Flight 447 incident and develop recommendations for incorporating experiential knowledge into commercial aviation safety protocols. The group included representatives from airlines, maintenance organizations, pilot unions, and safety research institutions. Dr. Patricia Williams, the FAA's Deputy Associate Administrator for Aviation Safety, chaired the working group and had become personally invested in understanding the lessons from Maggie's intervention. What we're looking at, Dr. Williams explained during one of the group's monthly meetings, is how to create formal pathways for technical expertise to influence safety decisions, even when that expertise comes from unexpected sources. The challenge was significant. Commercial aviation's remarkable safety record was built on standardized procedures, objective criteria, and systematic approaches to problem solving. Introducing subjective assessments and experiential knowledge into this framework required careful consideration of how to maintain safety standards while allowing for human insight. One of the working group's first initiatives was to study similar incidents from around the world where experienced personnel had detected problems that formal systems had missed. They found dozens of cases spanning several decades, ranging from maintenance technicians identifying engine problems through sound analysis to pilots detecting flight control issues through subtle changes in aircraft handling characteristics. Captain Lisa Rodriguez, representing the Airline Pilot Association on the working group, brought a pilot's perspective to the discussions. What the Flight 447 incident demonstrates is that safety is enhanced when we create an environment where anyone with relevant expertise feels empowered to contribute to safety decisions. Mrs. Sullivan's background gave her insights that our crew might not have had, but the critical factor was that our captain was willing to listen. The working group's research revealed that many aviation accidents and incidents could have been prevented if early warning signs had been properly recognized and acted upon. In several cases, personnel with relevant experience had noticed anomalies but hadn't felt empowered to challenge formal procedures or established protocols. Meanwhile, at aircraft maintenance training facilities around the world, the Flight 447 case was being incorporated into curricula as an example of how experiential knowledge could complement technical training. The Aviation Institute of Maintenance in Virginia Beach began using audio recordings of various engine conditions to train technicians in acoustic diagnosis techniques. What we're learning from Mrs. Sullivan's intervention is that listening to engines is a fundamental skill that we need to emphasize more in our training programs, explained Chief Instructor Robert Martinez. Modern diagnostic equipment is incredibly sophisticated, but it can't replace a trained ear and experienced judgment. The Institute developed a new course module called Acoustic Engine Diagnostics that used recordings from both military and commercial aircraft to teach students how to recognize the subtle sound signatures that indicate developing problems. The course became so popular that it was eventually adopted by maintenance training programs throughout North America and Europe.
At Boeing's headquarters in Chicago, engineers were studying the Flight 447 incident as part of their ongoing efforts to improve aircraft monitoring systems. The fact that the engine bearing failure had progressed to near catastrophic levels without triggering alerts from the 737's sophisticated diagnostic systems prompted a comprehensive review of engine monitoring protocols. What we learned from this incident is that there are acoustic signatures of developing failures that our current sensor arrays don't capture effectively. We're now working on incorporating acoustic monitoring technology that can detect the kind of harmonic distortions that Mrs. Sullivan identified. The research led to the development of advanced acoustic monitoring systems that could analyze engine sound signatures in real time and alert flight crews to developing problems before they became critical. These systems were designed to complement, not replace, existing monitoring technology, providing an additional layer of safety detection. International aviation organizations also took notice of the Flight 447 case. The International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, commissioned a study of maintenance protocols across member nations, specifically looking at how different countries incorporated experiential knowledge into their safety systems. The study revealed significant variations in how aviation authorities around the world approached the balance between objective criteria and subjective expertise. Some countries had formal protocols for incorporating experienced personnel's assessments into maintenance decisions, while others relied exclusively on measurable, documented criteria. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, leading the ICAO study, presented preliminary findings at the World Aviation Safety Summit in Montreal. What we're seeing is that the most effective safety systems combine the reliability of objective measurement with the insight of human experience. The challenge is creating frameworks that allow for this integration while maintaining the consistency and accountability that aviation safety requires. Back in the United States, major airlines began implementing programs inspired by the Flight 447 incident. United Airlines developed a technical advisory program that allowed experienced maintenance personnel, pilots, and other qualified individuals to provide input on aircraft condition assessments, even when they weren't part of the formal maintenance process. The program created structured pathways for reporting concerns based on experiential observation, with clear protocols for investigating and responding to such reports. Within 2 years, the program had identified more than 50 potential problems that might have been missed through standard procedures alone. Air American Airlines implemented a similar program, and Delta Airlines began incorporating acoustic analysis training into their maintenance technician certification requirements. The industry-wide response demonstrated how a single incident could catalyze systemic improvements in safety culture and procedures. For Maggie Sullivan, watching these developments unfold was both gratifying and humbling. She had never imagined that her intervention on Flight 447 would lead to such widespread changes in aviation practices. During a phone interview with Aviation Weekly magazine, she reflected on the broader implications of her experience. I think what's most important about all these changes is that they're recognizing something the military has always known. Safety is everybody's responsibility, and experience matters. Whether you're a pilot, a mechanic, a flight attendant, or even a passenger with relevant background, if you see something that doesn't seem right, you need to speak up.
2 years after the Flight 447 incident, Maggie Sullivan found herself in an unexpected role as a consultant and safety advocate, traveling around the world to share her experience and expertise with aviation organizations, training institutes, and safety researchers. What had begun as a routine flight to visit her grandchildren had evolved into a second career dedicated to improving aviation safety through the integration of human experience and technical knowledge. Her work took her to places she had never imagined visiting. In Singapore, she addressed the Asian Aviation Safety Conference, discussing the importance of creating safety cultures where experienced voices are heard and valued. In London, she consulted with Rolls-Royce engineers on developing better acoustic monitoring systems for commercial aircraft engines. In Sao Paulo, she worked with Brazilian aviation authorities to develop new maintenance training protocols that emphasized experiential knowledge alongside technical procedures.
But perhaps her most meaningful assignment came from an unexpected source, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. NASA's Aviation Safety Reporting System, ASRS, had been studying the Flight 447 incident as part of their research into human factors in aviation safety. And they invited Maggie to help develop new approaches to capturing and analyzing experiential knowledge from aviation professionals. Dr. Sarah Kim, NASA's lead researcher on the project, explained the significance of Maggie's contribution during a project briefing at the agency's Ames Research Center in California. Mrs. Sullivan's intervention represents a perfect case study in what we call expert intuition, the ability of highly experienced professionals to detect problems through pattern recognition that goes beyond conscious analysis. The NASA project aimed to contend systems that could capture and catalog the kind of experiential knowledge that Maggie possessed, making it available to aviation professionals worldwide. The research team was working on creating databases of acoustic signatures, visual indicators, and other subtle signs that could indicate developing problems in aircraft systems. What we're trying to do, Dr. Kim continued, is find ways to systematize experiential knowledge without losing its essential human element. Mrs. Sullivan can hear things in an engine that even sophisticated computers miss, and we want to understand how to train others to develop similar capabilities. The project involved recording Maggie as she analyzed various engine sounds, documenting her thought processes and decision-making criteria. The recordings would be used to develop training materials that could help maintenance technicians and flight crews develop more sophisticated diagnostic skills. During one of these recording sessions, Maggie listened to audio from a Boeing 777 engine that had experienced a failure 6 months after the recording was made. Within minutes, she identified subtle harmonic distortions that she said indicated bearing wear, though the engine had passed all formal inspections at the time of the recording. This is exactly what we heard on Flight 447 in the early stages. The bearing races are starting to separate, allowing metal-to-metal contact. You can hear it in the way the harmonic frequencies don't align properly during idle transitions, she explained to the NASA researchers. Dr. Kim and her team were amazed by Maggie's ability to detect problems that weren't apparent to their trained engineers. Mrs. Sullivan, how do you know what to listen for? What specifically tells you that a bearing is failing rather than some other component? Maggie thought carefully about the question, trying to articulate knowledge that had become almost instinctive after decades of experience. It's a combination of factors, she explained. Bearing failures have a very specific acoustic signature, a kind of metallic roughness that occurs at precise frequency intervals. But it's not just the sound itself, it's how the sound changes under different operating conditions. She continued, a healthy bearing produces harmonics that are mathematically related to the engine's rotation speed. When a bearing starts to fail, those mathematical relationships break down, and you get frequency variations that don't match the engine's fundamental operating rhythm. It's like listening to an orchestra where one instrument is slightly out of tune. Experienced ears can detect the discord even when it's very subtle. The NASA research team was documenting these explanations as part of their effort to create training materials that could help other professionals develop similar diagnostic skills. The project represented a new approach to aviation safety education, one that recognized the value of human expertise while working to make that expertise more widely available. Meanwhile, the practical impact of lessons learned from Flight 447 continued to emerge in the commercial aviation industry. Airlines reported that new training programs emphasizing acoustic diagnosis and experiential assessment had led to the early detection of dozens of potential problems that might have otherwise gone unnoticed until they became critical. United Airlines reported that their technical advisory program, inspired by Maggie's intervention, had identified 47 common potential safety issues in its first 2 years of operation. These ranged from engine problems similar to the one Maggie had detected, to hydraulic system anomalies, electrical irregularities, and structural concerns that experienced personnel had noticed through visual or auditory observation. Captain Robert Hayes, who had been promoted to chief pilot for United's Denver hub, became a strong advocate for incorporating experiential knowledge into aviation safety protocols. During a presentation at the International Air Safety Seminar, Hayes reflected on the lessons learned from Flight 447. What Mrs. Sullivan taught us is that safety is enhanced when we create an environment where experience and expertise are valued regardless of their source. As pilots, we're trained to gather information from all available sources before making critical decisions. That should include the insights of anyone who has relevant knowledge, whether they're part of our crew or passengers who happen to have professional expertise. The Flight 447 incident also influenced international aviation safety standards. The International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, incorporated recommendations from the incident into their updated standards and recommended practices for aircraft maintenance and safety management systems. These new guidelines encouraged member nations to develop protocols for incorporating experiential knowledge into their aviation safety frameworks. For Maggie, the global response to her intervention was both overwhelming and deeply satisfying. During a keynote speech at the World Aviation Training Conference in Dubai, she reflected on how a single moment of decision had led to such widespread changes in aviation safety practices. She went on to iterate to the audience, "When I stood up from seat 8F and approached the flight crew with my concerns, I was just doing what I had been trained to do, trust my expertise and speak up when I detected a safety issue. I never imagined that one flight would lead to changes in training programs, maintenance protocols, and safety standards around the world." She concluded her speech with a message that had become central to her advocacy work. The most sophisticated technology in the world cannot replace human experience and judgment. Our responsibility as aviation professionals and as human beings is to ensure that experience and technology work together to keep people safe.
5 years have passed since that fateful Tuesday morning when United Flight 447 turned back to Denver International Airport, and the legacy of Maggie Sullivan's intervention continues to reverberate throughout the aviation industry. What began as one woman's decision to trust her expertise and speak up about a safety concern has evolved into a fundamental shift in how the aviation community thinks about human factors, experiential knowledge, and the integration of diverse expertise in safety-critical decisions. Today, Maggie Sullivan is 78 years old, still traveling regularly, but now often as an invited speaker rather than a simple passenger. Her modest home in Colorado Springs has become an informal archive of aviation safety materials, filled with correspondence from pilots, mechanics, safety researchers, and aviation students from around the world who have been inspired by her story. On this particular morning, she's preparing for what will likely be her final major speaking engagement, a keynote address at the International Aviation Safety Summit in Washington, D.C., where she will receive the International Civil Aviation Organization's highest honor for contributions to global aviation safety. As she packs her suitcase, Maggie reflects on the journey that brought her to this moment. The worn Thunderbirds patch that she showed to flight attendant Sarah 5 years ago now sits in a place of honor on her desk, alongside letters from pilots whose lives may have been saved by training programs inspired by the Flight 447 incident. One letter from a young maintenance technician in Germany particularly moved her. "Mrs. Sullivan," it read, "because of the training program our company developed based on your experience, I was able to identify a developing engine problem on a Lufthansa aircraft last month. The engine was shut down preventatively, and post-inspection analysis confirmed that catastrophic failure would have occurred within hours. Your courage to speak up on Flight 447 may have saved lives that you'll never know about." Stories like these had become common over the past 5 years.
Airlines around the world reported dozens of incidents where personnel trained in acoustic diagnosis and experiential assessment techniques had identified problems that conventional monitoring systems had missed. The Sullivan protocol, as it had come to be known, despite Maggie's discomfort with the term, had been adopted by aviation authorities in over 40 countries. The changes extended beyond technical training. Aviation safety culture had evolved to place greater value on diverse perspectives and experiential knowledge. Flight crews were now trained to seek input from passengers with relevant expertise during unusual situations. Maintenance organizations had developed formal protocols for incorporating subjective assessments into their decision-making processes, and safety reporting systems had been enhanced to capture and analyze experiential knowledge alongside traditional incident data. Dr. Patricia Williams, now the FAA's administrator, had become one of Maggie's closest collaborators in developing new approaches to aviation safety. During a pre-summit interview, Dr. Williams reflected on the broader impact of the Flight 447 incident. What Mrs. Sullivan demonstrated was that safety is enhanced when we create systems that can effectively integrate human expertise with technological capability, Dr. Williams explained. Her intervention didn't just save 147 lives that day, it sparked a revolution in how we think about human factors in aviation safety. The data supported Dr. Williams' assessment. Independent analysis by the Flight Safety Foundation showed that implementation of experiential knowledge protocols inspired by the Flight 447 incident had contributed to a measurable reduction in engine-related incidents across the global commercial aviation fleet. Over the 5 years since Maggie's intervention, more than 200 potential engine failures had been prevented through early detection methods that incorporated human expertise alongside traditional monitoring systems. Boeing and Airbus had both integrated acoustic monitoring technology into their latest aircraft designs, creating automated systems that could detect the kind of harmonic distortions that Maggie had identified on Flight 447. But engineers emphasized that these systems were designed to complement, not replace, human expertise. As Mrs. Sullivan taught us, there are aspects of aircraft behavior that experienced humans can detect before any computer system, explained Dr. Maria Santos, Airbus's chief safety engineer. Our new monitoring systems are essentially trying to digitize human expertise, but we recognize that the human element remains irreplaceable. The aviation training industry had been transformed as well. The Aviation Institute of Maintenance now required all students to complete coursework in acoustic engine diagnosis as part of their certification requirements. Similar programs had been adopted at training facilities worldwide, creating a new generation of maintenance professionals who combine traditional technical skills with enhanced sensory diagnostic capabilities. Captain Robert Hayes, now United Airlines Vice President for Flight Operations, had become a passionate advocate for crew resource management protocols that incorporated external expertise. Under his leadership, United had developed industry-leading procedures for engaging with passengers who possessed technical knowledge during unusual situations. The Flight 447 incident taught us that expertise can come from anywhere, Hayes explained during a recent safety conference. Our job as aviation professionals is to create environments where that expertise can contribute to safety outcomes regardless of its source. The academic community had also embraced the lessons from Flight 447. Universities with aviation programs now included case studies of Maggie's intervention in their curriculum, using it to teach students about the importance of speaking up when safety is at stake, regardless of organizational hierarchy or formal authority. Dr. James Peterson, the aviation safety researcher who had been among the first to analyze the Flight 447 incident, had spent 5 years studying the broader implications of Maggie's intervention. His research had identified dozens of historical aviation accidents that might have been prevented if similar protocols for incorporating experiential knowledge had been in place. What Mrs. Sullivan's story demonstrates is that safety is ultimately about people, their knowledge, their courage, and their willingness to act when they see something wrong. Technology and procedures are essential, but they're only as effective as the humans who use them. As Maggie prepared to leave for Washington in her final major speaking engagement, she received a phone call that brought her story full circle. The caller was Captain Jennifer Martinez, the first officer from Flight 447, who was now a senior captain with United Airlines and had been selected to present Maggie with the ICAO award. "Mrs. Sullivan, I wanted you to know that not a day goes by that I don't think about what you did for us on Flight 447. You didn't just save our lives, you changed how I think about aviation safety and the responsibility we all have to listen to experienced voices." Martinez continued, "I've had 3 occasions during my career where passengers with technical backgrounds have approached me with safety concerns. Each time, I remember your example and Captain Hayes' decision to take your assessment seriously. In one case, a retired Navy aircraft mechanic helped us identify a hydraulic problem that our systems hadn't detected yet. Your courage to speak up on Flight 447 may have saved lives that you'll never know about." The conversation reminded Maggie of why she had continued her advocacy work despite the demands of travel and public speaking. Every prevented accident, every life saved through early problem detection, every young technician trained to trust their expertise, these were the real measures of her legacy. During the flight to Washington for the awards ceremony, Maggie found herself thinking about her late husband James and the conversations they had shared about the responsibility that comes with technical expertise. James had always believed that knowledge was meant to be shared, that experience had value only when it was applied to help others. As the aircraft climbed to cruising altitude, Maggie listened to the engines with the same practiced ear that had detected the bearing failure on Flight 447 5 years ago. These engines sounded healthy, their harmonic signatures clean and mathematically precise, but she remained alert, knowing that her role as an informal aviation safety monitor would continue as long as she was able to fly. The ICAO awards ceremony was attended by aviation safety professionals from around the world, many of whom had been influenced by the changes that followed the Flight 447 incident. As Maggie accepted the award from Captain Martinez, she looked out at an audience that included pilots, mechanics, air traffic controllers, safety researchers, and aviation students from around the world, all united by their commitment to making aviation safer. "This award belongs to everyone who has ever spoken up when they saw something that didn't seem right," Maggie said in her acceptance speech. "It belongs to the maintenance technicians who trust their ears, the pilots who listen to their crews, and the organizations that create cultures where experience and expertise are valued." She concluded with a message that had become her signature. Safety doesn't have rank, and expertise doesn't require a uniform. Whether you're sitting in the cockpit, working in a hangar, or traveling in seat 8F, if your experience tells you something isn't right, you have both the right and the responsibility to speak up. Because in aviation, as in life, silence in the face of danger isn't just wrong, it's dangerous. As the ceremony concluded and Maggie was surrounded by well-wishers and colleagues, she reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this moment. She had never imagined that a routine flight to visit her grandchildren would lead to fundamental changes in global aviation safety practices. But perhaps that was the real lesson of Flight 447, that ordinary people with extraordinary knowledge and the courage to use it could make an extraordinary difference.
The quiet woman from seat 8F had found her voice, and the aviation world was safer because she had chosen to use it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.